first of all, I would be remiss if I didn't highlight what a success it is that 10 months into the president's administration, you're asking me about a peace plan in Gaza, because that's a legitimate reality on the ground right now in the region. And it's only because of this president's leadership that was able to take place, that all the living hostages were returned. All but one body of the deceased hostages has been returned, and we're still, of course, working on the last one. As for this next phase of the peace process, there is a lot of quiet planning that's going on behind the scenes right now for phase 2 of the peace deal. And when the United States is ready to make those announcements public on the Board of Peace, the ISF, and the Palestinian technocratic government, we will be making those announcements at the appropriate time. But the reason that, the negotiators and the teams on the ground have been rather quiet about this is because I spoke with them this morning.
Let me be absolutely clear about what we just witnessed, because this is the kind of rhetoric that makes the blood run cold when you actually understand the implications of American empire reasserting itself with this grotesque colonial arrogance. And the thing that should terrify you if you're paying any attention at all is that Trump threatened Hamas with complete obliteration just weeks ago and gave them ultimatums while calling this 20-point plan extremely fair. And now here's this spokesperson standing at the podium talking about success and leadership and the return hostages, as if the entire apparatus of American military and diplomatic power orchestrating the political future of millions of people from Washington conference rooms is somehow a benign development, rather than the latest chapter in a century-long project of denying Palestinian self-determination. The audacity is breathtaking, and I need you to understand that this isn't hyperbole, because what we're watching unfold in real time is a plan that calls for demilitarization of Gaza, deployment of an international stabilization force, transitional governance by Palestinian technocrats under international supervision, and large-scale reconstruction with a conditional pathway toward Palestinian statehood, which sounds almost reasonable until you realize that below the Board of Peace chaired by Trump himself will be an executive board including Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, and Tony Blair overseeing a Palestinian technocratic government of 12 to 15 Palestinians with management experience not affiliated with any Palestinian political party, and the colonial arrogance of hand-picking who gets to govern occupied territory should make every progressive person's skin crawl, because this is literally the dictionary definition of imperial trusteeship dressed up in the language of peace and prosperity. And here's where it gets even more sinister, and you need to stay with me, because the resolution enshrined problematic elements, particularly the sidelining of Palestinian sovereignty and international law and disregard for Israel's responsibilities, including in the West Bank, which is exactly what critics warned about from the beginning, that this entire framework exists to legitimize what amounts to permanent international control over Palestinian territory, while Israel faces zero accountability for what has been described as genocide in Gaza. Following the October 7 attacks and the subsequent military campaign that has now killed over 70,000 Palestinians, according to recent reports. But the spokesperson wants you to focus on the hostages being returned, and yes, that matters enormously to those families. But only 2 hostages remains are thought to still be in Gaza, according to Israeli officials, and the last 20 living hostages were released on October 13th as part of the Gaza peace plan, which means we're essentially at the end of Phase 1, and now comes the truly revealing part, where the second phase involves Israel pulling out of more of Gaza, with an international stabilization force deploying, and a new governing structure, including Trump's Board of Peace, coming into force. And you should ask yourself, what kind of peace requires the American president to personally chair an international body controlling another people's government? The answer is no peace at all, but rather the institutionalization of occupation under a different guise. The Board of Peace is not a UN subsidiary body, but a sui generis entity with no criteria for appointments, no guarantee of Palestinian representation, and no mechanism for UN oversight, which means Trump and his hand-picked cronies, including his own son-in-law, who has extensive real estate interests, will be determining Gaza's future. And if you think that's going to prioritize Palestinian welfare over American and Israeli strategic interests, then I have a bridge to sell you in occupied territory. The technical language obscures the raw power dynamics at work here, because when the spokesperson mentions quiet planning behind the scenes and being deliberate and thoughtful, what they're actually describing is the United States being in the final stages of achieving consensus with Israel, the Palestinian Authority, and countries in the region on the composition of the technocratic government, which is diplomatic speak for powerful actors deciding who gets to have a voice and who doesn't. And notice how Hamas, which actually won democratic elections in Gaza back in 2006, is completely excluded from this process, while simultaneously being told they must disarm or face obliteration. And that brings us to the core contradiction that exposes the entire charade, because Hamas says it aims to create guarantees that war doesn't return and is potentially willing to hand over weapons, but rejects Netanyahu's demand to take their weapons by force, which is rejected by the Palestinian people. While Trump's plan stipulates Hamas will disarm even though the group has reasserted control during the ceasefire and shown no signs of disarmament, with no other power interested in disarming them through military intervention, which means the entire second phase rests on an impossibility, unless we're talking about forced disarmament, which would inevitably mean more violence and more Palestinian deaths. Let me take you deeper into this nightmare, because the International Stabilization Force is tasked with ensuring demilitarization by destroying military infrastructure and decommissioning Hamas's weapons in a peace-enforcing, not peacekeeping mission, meaning the ISF could use force, but no country will agree to fight Hamas on Israel's behalf, nor provide troops for this purpose, and as one analysis noted, Hamas's consent will be needed with disarmament negotiated rather than imposed, which brings us right back to the fundamental question of Palestinian political agency, that this entire plan systematically denies. The colonial echoes are deafening, and I'm not being rhetorical when I invoke that framework, because Progressive International condemned this as a blueprint for further colonization and subjugation, with special economic zones to integrate Gaza into global capital accumulation, placing Palestinian land and labor under foreign investor control from Wall Street to Silicon Valley without a single Palestinian voice. And this is precisely how imperial power operates in the 21st century, not through direct military occupation alone, but through economic integration and supposedly neutral international governance structures that perpetuate dependency and control. And we should be absolutely furious about the framing of this as Trump's success, because what kind of moral universe celebrates as diplomatic achievement Israeli strikes that have killed 366 Palestinians since the ceasefire came into force on October 11th, while Israel agreed to allow 600 trucks of aid into Gaza daily, but only an average of 459 trucks per day have actually entered, which is a clear violation of the agreement and has left people suffering under catastrophic humanitarian conditions. But somehow that doesn't factor into the success narrative being peddled from the White House podium. The technocratic language is doing so much work to obscure the violence here, because the U.S.-Israeli plan envisions an apolitical technocratic Palestinian entity that functions only as a service provider like the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, with the plan excluding the PA from governance, until it implements ill-defined reforms that require terminating pursuit of legal accountability against Israelis for war crimes, which is absolutely extraordinary when you think about it, that the price of Palestinian self-governance is dropping war crimes prosecutions against their occupiers. This is what impunity looks like institutionalized at the international level, and the resolution arrives 16 months after the International Court of Justice declared Israel's continued presence in occupied Palestinian territory unlawful and affirmed the Palestinian people's inalienable right to self-determination. But apparently that legal framework means nothing when American power decides it has a better plan that happens to align with Israeli security interests and involves Jared Kushner overseeing reconstruction in territory that his father-in-law's administration is actively helping to depopulate and remake. The historical parallels are impossible to ignore, and critics have branded this a second Balfour Declaration or perhaps a second Nakba, with the plan showing indifference to Palestinians' identity and dignity, while Trump ignores that Netanyahu is responsible for turning Gaza into a demolition site. And that's not progressive hyperbole, but the assessment of serious international relations scholars who understand that what we're witnessing is the potential erasure of Palestinian national aspirations under the guise of pragmatic peacemaking. I want you to sit with the sheer arrogance of Trump administration planning to appoint an American two-star general to command the International Stabilization Force, which will further increase U.S. responsibility for securing and rebuilding Gaza, turning it into the biggest U.S. political civilian military project in the Middle East in more than. And if that doesn't sound alarm bells about neo-colonial control, I don't know what will, because we're talking about American military personnel commanding an international force on Palestinian land to enforce a political settlement that Palestinians themselves had no meaningful role in negotiating. The spokesperson's cheerful tone about returned hostages and thoughtful planning cannot mask the fundamental injustice at the heart of this arrangement. U.S. officials stressed to European diplomats that if their countries won't send soldiers to the ISF, or support it, the Israeli military won't withdraw from areas of Gaza it occupies, with the message being, if you're not ready to go to Gaza, don't complain that the IDF stay. which reveals the coercive logic underlying this entire framework where Palestinian territory remains under foreign military control indefinitely unless other countries agree to participate in this imperial project. And here's what should terrify every person who cares about international law and human rights, because Russia's ambassador explained their abstention by saying the Council was giving its blessing to a U.S. initiative based on Washington's promises, while giving complete control over Gaza to the Board of Peace and ISF, whose modalities we know nothing about, which is a fairly damning assessment even from a country with its own imperial ambitions, and highlights how this resolution essentially hands Gaza over to Trump's personal administration of an occupied territory. The question of who actually governs Gaza and on what terms has been the central issue since Hamas won elections in 2006, and Hamas officials said they're willing to step down from governing Gaza but won't disarm until a Palestinian state is established, which is actually a completely reasonable political position when you think about it, that a resistance movement fighting military occupation won't surrender its weapons until there's an actual political settlement that guarantees Palestinian rights. But that's not how American power sees it, because American power demands unconditional surrender, followed by indefinite trusteeship. The spokesperson talks about Phase 2 planning as if it's a done deal, but Qatar's prime minister said discussions are at a critical moment with a ceasefire unable to be completed unless there's full withdrawal of Israeli forces and stability, with Egypt's foreign minister saying the international force is needed as soon as possible, while Norway's foreign minister warned the ceasefire cannot hold for many more weeks in its current phase, which suggests that international mediators understand the fragility of this arrangement and recognize that without genuine political progress, the violence will inevitably resume. But genuine political progress would require addressing the fundamental questions of Palestinian sovereignty and Israeli accountability that this plan systematically avoids. Since the ceasefire began, Israel has broken it more than 590 times, killing at least 360 Palestinians, with the total death toll above 70,000 under Phase 1, which required Israel to halt its war, pull back troops, allow aid in, and exchange prisoners. But somehow Israel's systematic violations don't invalidate the arrangement in the eyes of American officials, who continue to present this as a success story. The media framing around Trump's leadership, making this possible, is particularly galling when you understand the actual timeline, because the immediate triggering event that caused Trump to force Israel to end the war was the Israeli attack on Doha, which violated Qatar's territorial integrity, a failed attempt to kill Hamas negotiators with European and Arab countries strongly backing the proposal, amid increasing global opinion criticizing the Gaza genocide, which means Trump acted not from humanitarian concern, but from recognition that Israeli overreach was threatening American regional interests and relationships with Arab states whose cooperation Trump needs for his broader Middle East agenda. And that agenda includes normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman continues to resist, demanding a clear path toward a two-state solution, with Riyadh rejecting deepened alliance explicitly tied to recognizing Israel and insisting Saudi-US relations must stand on their own, which creates interesting pressure on the Trump administration, but doesn't change the fundamental problem that this plan treats Palestinian statehood as a distant conditional maybe rather than an immediate legally mandated right. The technical details of governance structures and reconstruction planning obscure the raw fact that Israel retains control of just over half of Gaza, with further withdrawals based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization, with no firm timelines, and Israel may refuse to pull back further, as its military chief called the Yellow Line, dividing Israeli-held Gaza, a new border serving as a forward defensive line, which is Israeli military officials openly saying they intend to maintain permanent control over large portions of Gaza, regardless of what any peace plan supposedly stipulates. This is annexation by another name, and the international community's acquiescence to this framework represents a catastrophic failure of the post-World War II legal order that was supposedly built on principles of self-determination and prohibition of territorial conquest, and critics argue that a peace imposed without meaningful Palestinian ownership cannot satisfy the right to self-determination, with legal observers watching whether the Board of Peace's decrees respect occupation law and whether the ISF operates as neutral peacekeeper or as proxy for Israel's security perimeter, and the answer seems blindingly obvious when you look at who's running these institutions and whose interests they serve. The spokesperson's claim about deliberate and thoughtful planning behind the scenes is particularly rich because the U.S. is working to recruit Palestinians for the technocratic government, with individuals reaching out to express interest because they realize Hamas is weaker than ever, and Palestinians from the diaspora are reaching out saying living under PA rule has been like living under the mafia, which is the Trump administration literally shopping for collaborators willing to administer occupied territory under foreign oversight and framing this as liberation from Hamas and PA corruption, rather than what it actually is, which is imperial client recruitment. The corruption argument is particularly cynical, because while Palestinian governance has certainly had corruption problems, the solution being offered is to place Gaza under the control of a largely symbolic board of peace, with the real power in an intermediate-level executive committee, filled by Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff, Tony Blair and former UN envoy Nikolai Mladenov, directly overseeing the Palestinian technocratic government. And if you think Jared Kushner, who has extensive real estate and investment interests, is going to prioritize Palestinian welfare over opportunities for capital accumulation, then you haven't been paying attention to how American empire operates in the 21st century. And we need to talk about what reconstruction means in this context, because the plan calls for creating modern, efficient governance, conducive to attracting investment, with a Trump economic development plan, created by convening experts who helped birth thriving modern miracle cities in the Middle East, synthesizing investment proposals to create jobs opportunity, and hope, which is development speak for turning Gaza into a free trade zone and luxury resort destination that benefits international capital while displacing the existing population or transforming them into service workers for foreign investment projects. This is gentrification on a civilizational scale, and Trump previously stated the United States would take over Gaza, level it, and have Palestinians removed so people from all over the world could be there, with Gazans relocated to beautiful areas and not permitted to return, creating the Riviera of the Middle East. And while that particular plan was walked back after international outcry, the logic underlying it, that Gaza is valuable real estate that would be better utilized without Palestinians, continues to animate this supposedly more moderate reconstruction framework. The violence required to implement any version of this plan is predictable and preventable, but apparently acceptable to American policymakers, because Israel has been attacking Gaza throughout the first phase, killing at least 360 Palestinians, and still restricts aid entry, with quantities far below what was agreed. Yet the spokesperson stands at the podium, talking about success and leadership, and the wonderful cooperation happening behind the scenes, as if systemic starvation and ongoing bombardment are just minor implementation details, rather than clear evidence of Israeli intent to make Gaza uninhabitable. And that brings us to the fundamental question that progressive analysis must confront, which is whether this entire framework is designed to fail in a specific way that achieves Israeli strategic objectives while providing diplomatic cover. And if the deal stalls, Gaza could be trapped in unstable limbo for years, with Hamas remaining in control of parts of the territory, Israeli army enforcing open-ended occupation, and residents stuck homeless, unemployed, unable to travel, and dependent on international aid, which may actually be the preferred outcome for significant factions within the Israeli government who have openly advocated for making Gaza unlivable as a way to force population transfer. The spokesperson's confident presentation of Phase 2 planning cannot obscure the fact that Hamas has rebuffed calls to disarm, though another Hamas official said the group was ready to discuss freezing or storing weapons with a Hamas source, saying the group will only give up weapons through negotiations, resulting in establishment of a Palestinian state, insisting this cannot be done by force or ultimatums, which is a political stalemate that makes the entire plan unworkable unless someone is willing to use massive violence to impose disarmament, which brings us right back to the question of who will die to make this arrangement function. European countries are notably reluctant to commit troops, and Europeans find themselves at an impasse, neither willing to fully implement the plan per U.S. demands, nor risk confrontation with Trump, but they must not default to passivity and should work with Arab partners to present Trump with a joint initiative that can operationalize the resolution to achieve sustainable peace, which is diplomatic language for trying to salvage something from this disaster. But the fundamental problem is that no amount of diplomatic finessing can overcome the plan's core deficiency, which is its systematic denial of Palestinian political rights. The Board of Peace as institutional mechanism reveals everything you need to know about American imperial hubris, because the proposed governance structure would be supervised by an external Board of Peace chaired by Trump and Tony Blair, with critics questioning the legitimacy and practicality of such top-down foreign-imposed administrative structure, which may struggle to gain consent of the governed in a deeply traumatized and politically fragmented society. And that assessment is, if anything, far too gentle, because what we're talking about is colonial administration, pure and simple, with all the historical baggage and predictable failures that entails. The spokesperson's cheerful discussion of making announcements at the appropriate time is the language of power that doesn't need to justify itself. U.S. Ambassador to the UN Mike Waltz says he expects upcoming announcements on Trump's peace plan advancement, stressing Washington won't allow Hamas to rebuild, with announcements expected soon on Board of Peace and Palestinian Technocratic Committee components. But notably absent from any of this discussion is what Palestinians themselves want, or how they might exercise meaningful self-determination, because apparently those questions are secondary to American strategic interests and Israeli security concerns. And we need to be very clear about what this means for international law and the precedents being set, because the Palestinian observer at the UN said the Council adopted the resolution primarily to maintain the ceasefire and move to Phase 2, rather than to advance Palestinian people's rights, adding that even the resolution's simple reference to Palestinian self-determination and statehood drove the Israeli government crazy, which tells you everything about the actual balance of power and whose interests are being prioritized when Palestinian statehood is treated as a distant aspiration rather than a legal right that has been recognized by the International Court of Justice. The spokesperson talks about returning hostages and careful planning, but what about the 70,000 Palestinians killed in this genocide and a full Israeli blockade this year, led to engineered famine, recognized by UN-backed food security classification in Gaza City, with Israel allowing slightly more aid since ceasefire, but far less than needs or agreement, stipulated, with aid agencies reporting desperate situation, and UNICEF identifying nearly 9,300 children under 5 with acute malnutrition. And these are not statistics but human beings whose suffering and death are being systematically erased from the official narrative of Trump's successful leadership. The media should be asking why the Biden administration's inability to secure a ceasefire is being reframed as Trump's diplomatic triumph, when several commenters argued the timing of the deal was motivated by Trump's desire to win a Nobel Peace Prize, with the 2025 prize announced October 10th, not awarded to Trump, which would be darkly funny if it weren't about a situation where tens of thousands of people have died and millions have been displaced while American leaders jockey for credit. This entire clip and the spokesperson's framing represents the banality of empire, where violence and dispossession get packaged as pragmatic problem-solving, and the Gaza peace plan likely serves dual purposes, as both genuine if flawed attempt to secure legacy-defining foreign policy deal, powerful domestic political instrument, with tough stance on Hamas, and unwavering Israel support, aligning with Republican-based sentiments, and even if the plan fails, it can be framed as political success for domestic audience, with Trump arguing he put forth bold, intelligent plan accepted by Israel, and the world only to be rejected by intransigent Hamas, which is the perfect crystallization of how American imperial projects operate, where Palestinian liberation is subordinated to domestic political calculation. So when you hear Trump officials bragging about this success and talking about thoughtful, deliberate planning, understand that what they're actually describing is the systematic dismantling of Palestinian political agency, the potential permanent partition of Gaza under foreign military control, the handover of reconstruction to international capital interests, and the elevation of American imperial prerogatives over international law and basic human rights, and that should terrify anyone who cares about justice, because if this precedent holds, there is no limit to what powerful states can do to weaker populations under the guise of peacemaking and prosperity. Reconstruction. This isn't peace, it's pacification. And we should say so clearly and repeatedly, until the entire rotten edifice of this plan collapses under the weight of its own contradictions, and is replaced by something that actually centers Palestinian self-determination and dignity, rather than American strategic interests and Israeli security obsessions, and until that happens, every pronouncement about success and leadership from podiums in Washington is just more propaganda obscuring ongoing genocide and dispossession.